okay, how did we end up? My eldest son always accuses me. He says, Mother, whenever I ask you something about Europe, you start with a history lesson. And by doing so, you frame the argument, which doesn't allow me to disagree with you. And I should try to avoid that, but I don't think you can not start with a history lesson, in a sense. But I'm going to try and do this in reverse order. If you were to say, I was a Blair babe. I was elected in 1997 as part of the Blair intake in a seat which in 1938 was represented by a man called Neville Chamberlain. So I occasionally have these historic conversations saying to Neville, 20 years on, your seat will be represented by a German, a socialist, one born near Munich, but don't worry, it's all democratic. But if you were to ask me on what has been the most earth-shattering moment in your political life, it has not been the day when the resignation of the British Prime Minister was the third item in the news, i.e. the 24th of June 2016, when the 8 o'clock news ran on the basis that the country's leaving the UK, the stock markets are about to crash, and by the way, the Prime Minister has also said he's packing it in. Actually, it has been the events since then, because I cannot remember any other time since the introduction of the suffrage where the political elites have refused to accept the outcome of a vote. It may also be the first time that the political elites have been defeated in a vote. But up to now, my experience has always been that occasionally you have an election. 1992, the country woke up on a Friday morning and was going, oh my God, we've got the Tories again? And arguably the 97 election was won 5 years later because people were going, we really didn't mean this to happen. 2010 in the United Kingdom. United Kingdom has a first-past-the-post electoral system which does not have coalition government, certainly not the way you would have them in continental Europe. 2010, we have an inconclusive election. Cameron goes into coalition. We have Lib Dem ministers, and nobody goes around and saying, oh, no, we have to have another election. However, what happened with this referendum, which I thought was absolutely extraordinary, you had a 72% turnout. You had a 3.8% margin of the vote. No, that's a proper margin. It's not like the Welsh referendum, which we had a few years before, on a 0.7 margin on a 51% turnout, and nobody questioned it. But this one is questioned. And I don't think the challenge for the United Kingdom and for Europe is how we deal or how we negotiate Brexit, because that separation is going to happen. And we will make it work. The real challenge for the United Kingdom is that it is currently in a democratic framework which is quite shattered and broken. And that was so even before the referendum. I remember going to see David Cameron before he called the referendum, together with a group of constitutional reform group. And he said to me a bit like Ian, he said to me, why do you care so much? Because I said to him, devolution in England outside London is seriously unfinished business. The reason why UKIP has risen is because England is asking itself who's speaking for us outside the cities. And you have not answered that question. UKIP is not about Europe. It is about devolution in England. And he kind of and I said, you're going to be the Prime Minister of a fractured country, irrespective of what happens on the referendum. So you have to understand the British referendum decision as a logical consequence, I would see it, of the Maastricht negotiations in 1994. It's when Britain said we will not be part of the single currency and we will not be part of the free travel area. And in a sense, the actual introduction of the single currency then crystallized a tension that had always been there. And for me, and the answer, how does someone like me end up with this? If David Cameron had come back in after what he called his renegotiations and said, the European Union recognizes that we require a new architecture framework which says some countries will always be part of the euro and those countries will have to integrate more deeply with democratic checks and balances, with a banking union, with a fiscal union. It will have to have a finance ministry. It will have to do all kinds of things which sovereigns do, because only a sovereign can create money. and there will be other countries which are not. And it's not, this audience will understand the term, it's not the typical British extravert, you guys always sort of slight. No, there will be quite a number of other countries. I would have said, you know what, let's give it a try.
To be honest, I was really surprised that the British voted like they have voted. For me, and I guess for most of the other observers, because we had this belief that in the end there will be a pragmatic decision, because it was clear for most of the observers, for journalists, for the elites, if you may call them so, that Britain would definitely be worse off economically outside the European Union. So why is it that these economical and pragmatic arguments in the end were not enough for the majority of the United Kingdom to remain inside the European Union? Why were those pragmatic arguments not enough to convince you?
Well, because for me it never was pragmatism on that sense. I have a belief which I may well be proved wrong on, but I so firmly hold on to it that I'm happy to go to my grave being told you were wrong on this. And that is that functioning democracies produce economic success, not the other way around. That economic success will not produce you democratic structures. And I think the European Union was a construct which was trying to get away from ideology. And I can see why mainland Europe sort of felt, don't give me strong people, don't give me ideologies, they don't lead to anything good. And you were giving way on the absence of democratic structures, which to me ultimately is I can remove those in charge of me. If you can promise a better economic tomorrow. That was the deal. In exchange for better economic tomorrow, you created a bureaucratic structure that did not comply with my needs of checks and balances of democracy.
You would accept the observation that at least on the short-term and mid-term range, Brexit will cause definitely economic problems for your country.
Well,
so you would face this reality. If
you ask people for a generational vote and you make a generational decision, then probably you don't measure it by what's happening the next 6 months. See, what I found so extraordinary is that first of all, you talk to we had big companies who were saying the global flows of people, goods, and money are with us. In terms of goods, we have, GATT became WTO. The global system is adjusting to how you deal with that. In terms of money, we're trying to get to a system where we calibrate what happened in 2008, which had in no small measure an uncontrolled private flows of capital, which we hadn't seen since the 19th century. In flows of people, we are failing, and the European Union just thought you could solve the problem by outsourcing the borders to Turkey with lots of money, not solving the problem. So we are not adapting to, Europe wasn't adapting to them. And I think the United Kingdom has simply decided on they're going to try and forge their own way.
My question is different. To what extent the vote, and I very much respect the vote, did not destroy the symbolic power of Britain? Because for a long period of time, there was a British mystique. Britain was perceived, in my view, as more influential, as stronger than it really was. And then suddenly, United Kingdom ended up as a normal country. And I'm interested to what extent you did not destroy with this popular vote what was the soft power of Britain.
Let's go back to 2001. So the European Convention on the Future of Europe happens. Tony Blair thinks that having reformed the Labour Party, having reformed the United Kingdom, he's now going to do that to Europe. The president of the Council of Europe was very much his idea that you needed construct in that structure, real deep engagement. And also the accession countries, when they were coming in up to 2004, their embassies tended to be, British embassy tended to be the Euro Commission office. The British looked after them during the convention, Bulgaria and Romania, quite extraordinary soft power. And then what happens is the British, always not the best with foreign languages. We found it increasingly difficult to even find diplomats who could speak two foreign languages, which they would require to get jobs in Brussels. The Foreign Office budget, our pensioners get winter fuel payments. Is it £200, £300 once in winter? The British government spends more money on winter fuel payments than he spends on its entire budget of the Foreign Office these days. When William Hague became Foreign Secretary, I thought, well, if I have to have a Tory government, at least it'll restore the Foreign Office to its great glory. It became a wholly owned subsidiary of UKTI. We have not only have we lost it. I think this is a challenge for a process of national renewal. And you can say, well, all these things you could have done within the European Union. Absolutely right, but we didn't do them. Skills shortages. The UK got itself in a position that it thought that rather than long-term planning, you could just always say, well, people will come to London. That is not a I challenged someone, because you also referred to being a Labour MP. I did a debate in the Shard, which is that great glass building, so that the working classes really were out that evening. And someone said, how can you support Brexit, which means that we can no longer get anybody to look after our nurseries, after our hospitals and our old people's homes? That's what we need migrant labour for. And I said, are you trying to tell me that you're prepared to envisage a society that is permanently structured in such a way that our young, our old and our sick are not looked after by people who we pay well, who we train well, but think it can only be done by people who it's the best job they can get? That, to me, is not a sustainable society.
But isn't it ironic in a way that your former party leader and former Prime Minister Tony Blair, how should I put it, somehow invited the so-called Polish plumbers to come to the United Kingdom?
There's really three elements which I want to tease out on this one. The Blair one, actually I talked to someone last night who was a special advisor in the Foreign Office at that time, and because I said, why did we go down this road? And he said, you have to see that in the context of, this was sort of, 97, the great Blair landslide was that you could trust Labour with the economy. And businesses wanted that, and the 2001, 2002, 3 decisions have to be seen in, that Labour was still, Blair was still trying to say, you can trust us, we were probably listening to big businesses too much. But the migration, and for those who weren't involved, there's UKIP and Nigel Farage, who were not the official Leave campaign. If they had been the official Leave campaign, the referendum would have been lost. Vote Leave which was Boris Johnson, me, and Michael Gove as the leaders. In a sense, we were very careful what we said about migration. I never talked about numbers because that's not my argument. Was how can you plan for public services? How can I plan for my schools? How can I plan for housing? How can I plan for all those things? But actually, I have no control of the numbers. So it was not the number, it was the fact that you have to plan it.
But would you agree that migration was a decisive factor in this referendum? Also the context of the so-called refugee crisis, which peaked in that time.
Well, and our inability to deal with global flows of people had pretty, it has an impact in Germany. I think it had pretty much impact in Italy. It had an impact. This is not a UK issue.
Yeah, just one question, because of course we'll go. But for me, this is also interesting because you started, and I very much agree with the fact that the relations between the people and the elites were very much changed as a result of Brexit, because you have a certain type of elite consensus. I don't mean only political elite, but particularly business and cultural elites. And then you have the people. But also there is one story which I found in the long term interesting for how Britain is going to rebuild its identity. And this is, you have the young generation that have been defeated on the referendum. So how you're going to believe that some of these people for whom the shaping experience was the loss of a referendum are going to build their identity as British voters, citizens, and so on. Because for me, this intergenerational politics is becoming critically important. And here, I want to provoke you to what extent you didn't kind of send the message to the youth that in a certain way, we like to talk about future, but it's not about your future.
I can't give you the answer, but let me take you to on that bit of the journey I've made on this so far, because I now chair something called Change Britain, and ahead of the 2017 election, we did 4,000 interviews, which a whole group of people, 2,000 before polling day, 2,000 after, and it was on a set of values. So it wasn't kind of who they're going to vote for. I was just trying to see where the coalitions were happening. And I could see where the coalition for the Corbyn almost getting to form the government were coming from. It was the Labour Party and that coalition was turning into something akin to the American Democrats. It was a rights-based, public sector worker, university-educated city. Then I could see where May's vote came from. But then when I was thrown into confusion is when we separated this on age and we did the under 35s and over to 35s. And that it sort of became to the under 35s, essentially Corbyn's vision was ahead on every indicator. And the only group where Corbyn wasn't ahead was people over 50 who paid off their mortgage. So I was kind of thinking, where my trouble comes from is where the under 35s, Thatcher's children, who actually were self-reliant, didn't need the state, or where they're becoming very left-wing, who wanted the state. And what the other thing I didn't know is to whether this was permanent. Having two children around that age group who just got married and have children, I kind of see them changing their tune quite considerably. No one's parenthood hits them. But then I was thrown into even more confusion by a conversation with a 35-year-old, works for KPMG, good income. And he said, no, you got this all wrong about the state. You've made such a mess of the state. He said, You've sold off the railways and they're not working. And you sold off the water industry and it's not working. And I'm not going to pay into pension because I've got no faith in it. And the reason why I have this emotional attachment to the National Health Service is because it's the only state institution I have any faith in. So I think there is what is happening out there, you're right, the young and the old, that relationship, but it's not going to fall along party political lines. I think there's going to be a real realignment of thinking about the future. The contributory principle is, you see, I thought they don't believe in the contributory principle, whereas they were telling me, saying, no, we just think you've made such a mess of it. I think for the United Kingdom, Parliament itself has an enormous challenge ahead of itself, that something that is a fairly established parliamentary representative democracy is introducing a significant element of participatory democracy. And all the struggles we're going through at the moment clearly shows that the institution hasn't quite worked out how to deal with that. Because if you create institutions which are not established parties, if you create coalitions for the purposes of a referendum, which then by definition have to dissolve afterwards, you have that question of who is responsible for implementing the outcome. And this is why this is why the defeat of the elites is so significant here. Because they thought it wouldn't be a problem because they would get the outcome. Cameron thought he would win, and therefore it wouldn't be a problem.
So, please. And yeah, okay, I know. So let's start with, they're two very important British voices. So, Skidelsky first.
I never vote in the House of Lords.
Said. My two comments are, first of all, the question I'm sometimes asked, what would Keynes have thought of Brexit? I think there are two things. First of all, he would have been very much against locking Britain into an economic structure which threw away so many of the tools he thought necessary for economic and political well-being. And I think he would have been very much against being locked into a system as rigid a defender of a self-regulating market as the Eurozone was set up to be. He would have agreed with Gisela here that you need a state in order to make a market work. And if you don't have a state, there are going to be problems in the market which are going to destroy it, or at least subject it to very serious political threat. So that's the first comment I'd make. Second comment on migration. I don't think it's entirely or even mainly a product of a matter of Polish plumbers. I think one's got to recall the history here of a very, very long-standing popular opposition to mass immigration. One has to go back to, say, Enoch Powell's speech in 1968, which got 80% support, but it was eliminated from politics, essentially. The parties got together. And somehow that's morphed into sort of opposition to free movement within Europe. So the idea of controlling your own borders became very central, but that has a sort of quite a long history behind it. And one of the other things that emerged, which is very strong, is that the people who voted against European Union are not those who are in a position to carry out the consequences of that. The consequences of that vote are actually the responsibility of the elites who are against it. And that's the whole plot that's going on in Parliament, in the House of Lords recently, particularly, the belief that somehow or other one could reverse the decision.
One more, because I want to have also, because we're really very privileged today, because we have also one more very important debate from the British side. It's Anthony Barnett.
I feel very torn, because I think that Gisela is a true Democrat, and her revulsion from the European constitutional process, I mean, is both genuine and justified. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that the British elite, which she has criticised, which is now taking the form of her colleagues Boris Johnson and Michael Gove and so on, have been utterly reckless in the way they have governed the United Kingdom. And we are now eating the fruits of what they have sown. But the other aspect of this is that Brexit is not going to work. It's not going to work in part for the very reasons you have described. This is a society in breakdown. And it is not a society capable of taking on the immense challenge of Brexit. And so in one simple aspect of this is that it is not possible to leave the European regulated space. We can negotiate a different relationship with it, but fundamentally the drive, the psychopathological drive of Brexit is a democratic freedom, and that, to be free of all that, and we can't be free of all that. And it's dishonest about migration. I mean, your campaign, one has to say this, you published the most terrible pamphlets on Turkey, maps of Turkey, saying Turkey will join the EU and our borders will be Syria, and great arrows, sort of pointing to a million Turks will arrive. And Boris Johnson, people say, well, I had nothing to do with it, I complained. But you were told by Cummings, there's a clear history of this, you have to back this, and you did back it. The last thing I would just say is this. You mentioned, or you said to Cameron, your people in England are not represented. Now, this is a distinction which the people here may not have heard or registered. Brexit, as well as being the vote of the old, was also an English vote. England, without London, voted by an 11% majority. Scotland, Northern Ireland, Wales was a tiny majority for Brexit of 80,000 people. It's an English nationalist vote. And that's another reason why it won't work, because Britain, the Great Britain that Brexit is supposed to represent, of Scotland and Wales and Northern Ireland, it wasn't a vote of the United Kingdom. It was a disuniting vote.
In terms of Turkey, can I just say to you that at that time, my nightmare was that David Cameron would get up and say, I'll exercise my veto. He could have killed, because at that stage, we were still paying towards a 3.5 billion budget, which was working towards Turkish accession. It was stated UK government policy, and he did not, well, it's no good shaking your head, he didn't, did he? And we paid towards the 3.5 billion. So, but where do we go from here? That is the real question, because quite frankly, as a politician, now that I'm no longer an MP, I could go home and just say, it's just not going to work, is it? Well, sorry, that's not how the future is shaped. And just to, the predictions about the future are hard to come by, but I tell you one thing, during the whole campaign, people were saying, you vote for Brexit and the United Kingdom will break up because Scotland will have another referendum, the SNP will win. What happened in the 2017 election? The SNP lost seats to the Tories. Nicola Sturgeon is no longer talking about the second referendum because she knows she wouldn't win it. And the United Kingdom is not breaking up.
Thank you. So I'm Austrian with family in UK, so I have parts of British origins too. And so I've been following this whole process of Brexit vote and what happened afterwards. What shocked me, of course, I was also shocked by the result. But what shocked me also is that there were, in the Leave campaign, obviously a lot of false fact or lies presented to the voters. And to me, it was a very populist campaign, a campaign that was not really based on facts, but on emotion, like this red bus going on with Boris Johnson will give the NHS 300 million a week, and so, which is clear. I mean, yeah, I think this is not a democratic process. So if democracy, it's fair to have a vote about this, but it should be based on real facts, on pros and cons, pros and contras, and not on this like emotional or really misleading arguments that the Leave campaign had. And now again, since 2 weeks, or I think 2 weeks where this Cambridge Analysis scandal came out. So my question is, how do you think of this now? And wouldn't it be fair now with all the knowledge what has gone wrong? There has been manipulating in this process of voting. And wouldn't it be fair to do a second referendum on really based facts? These are the facts we have, these are the advantages we have of the European Union, these are the figures, this is what we pay in, this is what we get back in subsidies, so that even simpler people and not the elite can understand what the European Union really is, what is the advantage to be in, what is maybe the advantage to be out, and then have a fair vote for everybody, which is based on facts. This is, I think, more democratic than the vote went out. So this would be my question, how you see this now. And my second question is a more personal, if I may. As a German and growing up in German, would you argue the same way for Germany to do a referendum and with the same argument that you now had for Brexit?
On facts, if the bus had said, we spent, what does it exactly say on the bus? As we're on facts, can you just repeat to me, what did the bus say?
Yeah, I think, this red bus where it give the NHS, we pay such and such per week in the...
Okay, so shall we start by sticking to the facts? which said,
I could Google it now.
I've stood in the bus often enough to sort of say,
120.
we send £350 million a week to the EU.
Yeah.
I'd rather spend it on the NHS.
Exactly.
If the figure... okay.
Exactly.
Why don't we? It was a suggested question.
Yeah, well, why? But let's come back. If the figure had said 400 million, it would have been wrong. Actually, it's right. It's 300.
Figure, right?
Okay, let's rewind. So it's a gross figure. It actually was 372 million. About a year later, I sat in an embassy lunch in the German embassy with Lionel Barber, the editor of the FT. And this was the night before they were running the story about how Brexit bill will be 100 billion. And he said, this we're going to run tomorrow. And I said to Lionel, is that a gross figure or a net figure? He said, it's a gross figure. I said, so the 350 million in the bus were okay. And he just turned his back to me and refused to speak to me for the rest of the evening. On facts, what happened to Osborne's emergency budget? And the families would be £4,853 worse off. The Leave campaign was allowed to raise £7 million from donors. We were allowed to raise that. Before the referendum was called, the government spent 9.2 million on a leaflet sent to every household. I mean, we can revisit the thing. What is clear is not just the conduct of referenda in terms of parliamentary democracy, but in terms of spending and things. But can I just urge you of one thing in terms of information? In my experience of having fought elections over 20 years, the electorate may be very inarticulate at times, but do not think they are stupid. You know? They
are manipulated.
You did it. So if Osborne's punishment budget and Obama's intervention had worked, then they would not have been manipulated. It's because you don't like the outcome that you think it's manipulated. At every election, people will make decisions on a whole base of things which are rational, irrational, and what have you. But please, let's not go down this thing of saying this particular one, because you didn't like the outcome, the electorate were too stupid.
No, I didn't absolutely want to point on that. I never think an election is stupid. I think it earns, it's only, because it is not stupid, it earns to have real understandable and facts, that anybody can compare, because as you also know, after the Brexit vote, the most Googled word was European Union. So obviously there is a lack of knowledge about that, and I think because electorate is not so stupid, they should have real valuable facts they could compare and it shouldn't have been just a yes-no question, but okay, it's not because I do not like the outcome, that's fine, and I said it's fair to have such a referendum, but also what about the Cambridge Analytica things with the manipulation?
Explain to me, what do you think Cambridge Analytica did in the UK referendum?
Well, it was the campaigning of this Facebook data and sending
in the Trump election, and if you look Zuckerberg at the moment,
but
you're making a charge at me. Tell me now.
No, I'm not making a charge.
No, come on. What did you think Cambridge Analytica did during the referendum?
It sent, like in the Trump election, it was used in the same way to go to the.
We know they did it for Trump. I mean, you see, the reason I'm challenging you so is that you're challenging me with the charge of unfounded facts and emotion, but you challenge me with a set of unfounded facts and emotions. So I'm just trying to get an equivalence here.
It's asymmetric. You won.
Oh, so therefore it was wrong. Oh, right, okay. So you have actually just put your finger onto it.
Yeah. But let us come to this question, which is often raised, I guess, even more often raised in the rest of Europe, and not as often in the UK. I think it's wishful thinking, but do you think that there is any probability that there could be a second referendum. I do not ask you whether
No,
you wish for one or
no,
just whether you
the
think.
thing which I find, you're really playing with fire here. And I was trying to address that at the very beginning of you. I think democratic structures are pretty fragile, and they're fragile everywhere. You know, why did Germany have a grand coalition? Because the two major parties were terrified of another election, the AfD having even more votes than it last time. I don't need to tell you how finely balanced things are here. Look at the election result in Italy. You know, I think democratic structures are so. If you go in a system and you have a referendum with a 72% turnout and a clear majority, then you could have one which would say, do you want no deal or this deal? But we are leaving. But one which said, dear voter, do you think you got it wrong last time? Quite, because however you would phrase the question, that's how it would be perceived. Not only would you have an even higher leave vote, but I think you would have undermined the institutions of your democracies irrecoverably.
Thank you very much. And we're very grateful that you're not staying in your garden and you have been talking to us. And we are really, I'm sure that there's going to be a political biography of you being written in some years. We can argue what is going to be the title, The Bavarian Who Rescued Britain, or The Bavarian Who Destroyed Britain. But I'm sure that they're going to be a great political biography. It was a great pleasure to have you here. Thanks.